Good afternoon. Thanks for coming out. I'm Lau Goldstein. I'm director of the China Initiative here at Watson. My focus is on studying Chinese military development, and turns out they're extremely interested in urban warfare. So I was definitely planning to attend this great event. But I'm actually filling in for Professor Dave Pilati, who is he's a senior fellow here at Watson. And he's also director of the Military Fellows Program, and he unfortunately he had a family event that he had to get off to, so he's sorry that he can't be here to host. But he wrote up some excellent introductory remarks. So if you'll forgive me, I'm just going to read these because they're very well written. So Dave says, we're honored to have with us one of the world's foremost authorities on a subject that sits at the critical intersection of military history, international law, humanitarian action, and the future of armed conflict. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the topics he will address today, urban warfare, civilian casualties, ongoing conflicts, are for many of us and for hundreds of millions of people around the world deeply traumatizing and profoundly controversial. And yet it is precisely because these subjects are so difficult that we must engage with them. Academia is one of the last places in the world where we can confront humanity's most critical challenges head on with rigor, with honesty, and with the mutual respect that makes genuine dialogue possible. It seems that this may no longer be possible to do on the battlefield, in the hallowed halls of the UN, or even in Washington, D.C. I would say especially in Washington, D.C. The goal here is not agreement, it is understanding, and ultimately it is making progress towards better protecting the civilians who bear the heaviest burden of modern conflict. Today's lecture, The Paradox of the Urban Character of Modern Conflicts, will take us through the history and evolution of urban warfare, exploring military strategy and tactics, the law of armed conflict, and civilian harm mitigation. Drawing on his cutting-edge field research from some of the most consequential battlefields of our time in Nagorno-Karabakh, Ukraine, Israel, and Gaza, our speaker brings both scholarly depth and real-world immediacy to these questions. He told me his phone is ringing off the hook from getting a request to talk about Iran. So I'm sure he'll share some thoughts on that too. John Spencer is one of the most important voices in this field, an award-winning scholar, author, combat veteran, and nationally recognized military analyst. He has advised the Army's top four-star generals and senior leaders from the Pentagon to West Point. He currently serves as chair of urban warfare studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point, the famous West Point, co-director of the Urban Warfare Project and host of the Urban Warfare Project podcast. He also holds the chair of urban warfare studies at the Madison Policy Forum, a New York-based think tank, and is a founding member of the International Working Group on Subterranean Warfare. His work does not sit on a shelf in a library. It shapes policy, informs commanders, and at its very core is animated by a profound commitment to understanding how armed actors fight so we can better protect those caught in the crossfire. Please join me in welcoming to Brown and to Watson, Professor John Spencer.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you everybody for joining me. I'm going to do about 45 minutes of conversation, and the period that I enjoy more is the questions that you have on your minds about the topic. I'm happy to actually be back at Brown. I know Dave from going way back, actually before even the Ukraine war, where Brown partnered with the Naval War College to hold civilian harm mitigation conferences. I did not know where my career would take me at that point. I was already solely focused on the history of urban warfare and the reality of it in Iraq and other places, the fight against ISIS. But the world has definitely changed from then, and my experiences have changed from that. One of the reasons I am called one of the world's leading experts on urban warfare is because there's nobody else. So it's pretty much a process of elimination, and it's both in academia and in the military. you'll find there are a few people who have either chosen or been allowed to, especially with the military, that's allowed to solely focus on combat in urban areas. And I fell into almost a PhD candidate's sweat or dream of finding something that nobody's done before. And because of that, I have been working on this for over 10 years. And I'm a student, so I actually learn something every day. Most people don't understand that my podcast is just my research for other people to listen into, because I have the commanders who have fought in battles, the experts in smart cities, feral cities, you name it, all on my podcast. And I'm just learning from them and advancing my own scholarly topic, because this field is so evolving. I usually start with a definition so we know what we're talking about. Urban warfare, that is not separate than war, which I taught strategy at West Point, which helps me a lot actually when I do a lot of news now. But urban warfare, that is, an urban environment is defined by the U.S. military as a man-made terrain with a population and infrastructure to support it. It's called the urban triad. And that's what you have to have, which really, if you're military, if you take all the people out of an area, it's not technically urban warfare, because it's not those three key components of it. And then warfare is actually the fighting. So that's armed resistance, fighting in an urban area, fighting in cities, and it is a shortcut. Now, why is this so hard? Which really gets to, I really like the topic of this lecture, the paradox of urban warfare. Why is it so hard? Of course, it's hard because of the physical terrain, right? Three-dimensional physical terrain of urban environments. I started my work back in 2014 looking at mega cities, which is any city of over 10 million, and they're rapidly rising around the world, rapid population growth, which causes political instability. But just from why is it so hard? The physical terrain of cities, urban areas in general, is already ready-made hard to fight in. If you're a defender, it makes it easier to do your job. Usually you would spend years, if not decades, preparing. Let's say you take an open piece of ground like in Ukraine, you got to dig trenches, you got to build foxholes, you got to do all this. In the urban environment, it's all there. You have concrete, subterranean, 3 dimensions, skyscrapers, you name it. Just from the physical aspect, we say it's harder. We don't say hard. I say more complex than any other environment. So you have the physical terrain, the presence of civilians. Despite the history of urban warfare, you've never been able to get 100% of the civilians, no matter how long you wait. There's usually, and I know the numbers matter, about 10% that stay no matter what happens. And there have been battles like the Battle of Aachen during World War II that both the Germans and the Americans evacuated the city 4 times. And there's still 10% of the civilian population that just for whatever reasons they can't or won't leave. So the presence of a population make it harder to do what a military should be doing, distinguishing between combatant, non-combatant, and all of that. And then the infrastructure in of itself adds to the complexity, because if a piece of infrastructure is destroyed, you really don't know the second and third order effects of it. So just the 3 attributes of the urban terrain make it harder to fight in, or it depends on what side you're on. But really, when you get into the urban environment, which leads to there's nobody else doing it, is because we militaries don't want to do it. We literally wrote into our doctrine, until I started helping rewrite it about 6 years ago, avoid and bypass as much as possible. Do not do it. Because, which I'm sure we'll talk about, the evolution of the laws of war, they're mainly, they go back centuries. Of course, they've been evolved strongly. They evolve, is about protecting those not involved in the conflict. So, whether it's distinction, proportionality, precaution, all of them are about the civilians. So yes, you militaries have your fights, and there are rules about what militaries can do to other militaries. But once you enter the urban terrain, it's already, while yes, fighting in the Himalayas is hard, and I've studied that, and fighting in swamps and jungles, I did that. It's all hard. But when you enter the urban environment, it's the first and the best, most difficult place, because there's already restrictions on the use of force, what you can and can't do as a military, based on us, the world, making agreements on here's the things we won't do. And it has evolved, and I get this all the time. post-World War II, of course, we have the Geneva Conventions, specifically the Fourth Geneva Conventions, which talks about protecting those not involved, the protected populations, the protected sites, all of that. So we don't do things like bombing cities to try to convince their governments we just don't do that anymore. But it makes it extremely hard, and it's a paradox. But most importantly, because of that aspect that militaries don't want to do it, they'll avoid it and bypass. And that's the paradox for me as somebody who's been doing this for a long time. I'm an advocate absolutely for civilian harm mitigation that we'll talk about, but I'm an advocate for militaries training, manning, preparing, and exercising urban warfare, not because I want job security. I have that. It's because I want them to get better at it so that they can make the operation go quicker, because that's really the goal of the military operation, is achieve the goal as quickly as possible with the least amount of harm to civilians and the infrastructure. So the paradox is militaries don't want to do it, don't prepare for it. But if they did, they would see less of it. And that's why we've actually seen a rise of urban warfare over the last, if not last 4 years, but if you go even to the period with ISIS, we saw more and more protracted siege battles than we had in history. Across the history of warfare, there is absolutely a history of urban fighting. Really, if you go back to the Peloponnesian Wars, things like that, it's about the cities. We as humans have a long history of fighting for cities, but not in cities. And that changed for many reasons. As the evolution of cities in general, there's just more urbanized terrain, right? In 2008, the world became more urbanized than rural. And if we get into definitions, which I hope we don't, even the United Nations struggles with defining urban. They define it as anything that's not rural, which it makes it hard. But we have more and more urban warfare for a bunch of reasons, especially the asymmetric element that somebody vying for political power, whether you're a non-state actor or a state actor, can use the urban terrain for an exponential advantage. We call urban terrain the great equalizer, because it doesn't matter how good your military, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it, how good your military is. If I can get you into the urban terrain, you have already equalized your capabilities against the attacker because of that urban terrain. It negates weapons. It negates all the world's best ISR, your weapons effects, all of it starts to equalize. It's not the great equalizer, but it definitely detracts. And really the only science there is about making that not possible is to get to the urban terrain first. Really, as we saw in my unique research is field research. I was studying, and I still am studying, almost every urban battle that's happened, so I understand. The U.S. military has very little urban warfare history. You go to World War II, there start to be a few events. Of course, other militaries do as well, but I am not U.S.-centric. I actually do case studies, and I think that's an amazing, and we'll talk about doing comparative analysis when you have actually uniqueness in the modern battles of today, like Gaza. There's a lot of uniqueness to it, but we do like to do comparative analysis to be able to compare to what is the realm of possible, what's happened in the past. The American military really has but few of what we really call intense urban operations. Of course, there's the Battle of Aachen, there's the Battle of Manila that I'll talk about. And then across the different wars, you get into like Hue City in Vietnam. And then you have Mogadishu in 1993. It was traumatic for the U.S. military. And I just released a podcast about the 2003 attack of Baghdad. And we were talking during lunch with the military fellows about, we have these things in the Army that everybody thinks we have everything called doctrine, which is the books. You have little d doctrine of what militaries write in their books, and then you have big D doctrine is the way they do things. And the way they do things can actually be strongly influenced by their history and culture. And when I jumped into northern Iraq, a part of the 2003 Iraq invasion, but when we took Baghdad, how much the Mogadishu experience in 1993 dominated the American military's thinking towards attacking the city of Baghdad. But really, we talked about understanding, and that's what I hope I help people do, is how do you even think about urban warfare today? First, you have to define it so you can tell people, yes, war against drugs, yes, even counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, all there may be urban elements of it, but I'm talking about urban warfare. So fighting in urban terrain. And really, in order to understand that, and this is why I have a lot of work to do and learning that I do every day, is because in order to understand urban warfare today, you, of course, and if I was to build a pedagogy, which I've built courses for the militaries on, if you want to understand urban operations, here are the things you have to be able to do. First, you, of course, have to understand urban warfare history. Know what's happened in the past, what went right, what went wrong. That's my case studies that I love to do, despite the labor of love of what we think happened versus what actually happened. And that is a part of, I'm sure, history in general. Sometimes they say the victor writes to history. I say the writer writes to history. So who wrote that historical record? And that's what I've found is even battle I took part of. I took part of the 2008 Battle of Sadr City as a commander, a very unique battle against a neighborhood of Baghdad of 2 million that we weren't allowed to go into, but then still assigned a mission to achieve, which is to get rockets to stop emanating out of that city. Its own history, but I participated in it and then went back to write the history of it. And I realized how little I knew at that level. And then interviewing all the commanders was so important. So understanding the history, which has really became very important for some of the operations going on right now, is people comparing past historical events that weren't the right ones to choose, right? And that's, I'm sure, in academic studies, right? You got to have the right apples to the right oranges, and part of that. The next thing is understanding the law of war. If you don't, you probably have heard, maybe you haven't, that the U.S. military doesn't use the term international humanitarian law. We use the term law of armed conflict. And there's a reason the Europeans use more IHL, international humanitarian law. I don't, because it actually starts to mix a lot of voices or theories or laws that are humanitarian rules or humanitarian law. And then you mix international humanitarian law, which is talking about the law of armed conflict. You allow people that are human rights activists or human rights lawyers even to intermix the two. I like to say focus on the law of armed conflict. What is the law that we say? And of course, there are many areas of this. There are the foundational principles like distinction, proportionality, the necessity, these foundational laws of war is the other terminology. And then there are, of course, customary laws. There are prohibitions that we all agree to, whether it's chemical warfare, whether that's cluster munitions, prohibitions, things like that. And there is customary law. All that big bucket, I've found as an urban warfare student that a lot of people, there are a lot of beliefs about the law of war. And I've spent, especially in the new information age, I do a lot of Law 101 for mass media, because some of the world will actually get convinced about what can and can't happen. One example is Amnesty International during the war, Russia's war against Ukraine in the early days, came out with a report saying that it was illegal for the Ukrainians to be in the cities they were defending, that it put the civilians at risk. But they actually made that bold statement despite like peer review saying that if a defender can't be near civilian objects, if he's defending, but it's their city. Of course, they should be in their city defending it. So I do a lot of basic War 101. And in order to start understand urban warfare, especially in the modern battlefield where a lot of the enemies try to intermix between civilians and try to do what's called lawfare, which is they're really good at understanding the laws of war and reverse engineer their strategies to use the laws of war against somebody that might attack them. Famously called, one of the aspects is human shielding, which I used to use Hamas as an example. We can talk about it, but that's using the evolutions of the law of war against the attacking military to restrict you from using force against them, but also then violating the laws of war by using protected sites and protected populations, a part of your military strategy. So in order to understand urban warfare, you have to have a really good depth of knowledge on what the law of armed conflicts says you can and can't do. When somebody's making a big assessment like white phosphorus is a war crime, no, it's not. White phosphorus in urban terrain is a war crime, no, it's not. That has been a big part of my work in order to understand. Next, you would have to, so you have to understand the history. You have to understand the laws around conflict, especially pertaining to urban combat. Then you have to understand really tactics, techniques, and procedures. How would a military attack a city, defend a city, whatever the mission they're trying to do? There are ways that have been an evolution to include the technologies. This has also been like, what's the difference between a dumb bomb and a precision guided munition? What's the probable error in these things, and can be used, what can't be used? And that's a big field of my research as well, is how do you do urban warfare, and how could you do it better? What could you do differently? And if you don't have that part of the puzzle, then it really makes it hard to understand what's going on if you don't understand what would be the correct military tactic to use in this case. Lastly, probably more importantly, if Dave was here, civilian harm mitigation, you would have to have a good depth of understanding. So these 4 things. Lastly, civilian harm mitigation, it's inherent in the law of armed conflict, right? It's part of precaution. It's part of proportionality assessments. Which if you don't know, proportionality, I'm sure everybody in the room knows, but I've had to teach a lot of people. Proportionality is never quantitative, it's qualitative. It's based on what the commander knows. It's an assessment of, one, having a valid military target, objective, call it what you want, that is concrete, a real military objective. And then you do a calculation based on if you take an action, that the collateral damage can't be excessive to the value of that military target based on the mission. So it's literally a qualitative assessment of what the commander knows. And then taking all the reasonable and feasible actions that the commander could take to lower that calculation of excessive damage. That's proportionality assessment. I think it's beautifully written. It actually requires this thought process before an operation. But over the last 30 years, through militaries fighting counterinsurgencies and counterterrorism operations, the realm of possible in civilian harm mitigation has evolved. And that's why Brown and the Naval War College had this annual conference trying to bring people together going, look, urban warfare is on the rise. Literally, and I have a graph. I didn't do PowerPoint this time, but just showing how much of just city battles were on the rise from World War II on. Much more frequent in just these city battles where somebody gets in there and you got to get them out. But so the militaries, especially Western militaries, those that follow the law of armed conflict, because there are some that don't. And I can tell you about those situations like Grozny, of the various Chechen wars, where there are tactics that have been used in the past that wouldn't be acceptable today. And they're not following the laws of war, not distinction, not any of the precautions. You have to have an understanding of the realm of civilian harm mitigation. Like what have militaries done over the last 30 years? Because this terminology is really a new terminology. Civilian harm mitigation measures. And we come here, we have conferences, we have reports on this is what commanders could do. I've been a part of writing actually commanders' handbooks on here's a better way, whether that's in targeting, because that's one area where people think there's civilian harm mitigation, which actually would be, if you're following proportionality, that reasonable and feasible steps to take in order to lessen civilian harm. But where people try to cut and paste because they're not informed about the evolution of what's called civilian harm mitigation, which is actually separate than the laws of armed conflict, is that they're misapplying what the best practice might be in a certain context of a war. Not all wars are the same. Not all cities are the same. Like the practice that during the Obama campaign in Afghanistan, he made a rule that 0 civilians could die if a terrorist was struck. It was just a policy. And that's not a civilian harm mitigation measure. That's a policy, which would be part of the urban warfare history. As I continue my studies, I deal a lot with these. I'm really digging down in my history part, and we'll have another book out sooner about urban warfare history, so you can understand the trajectory of what's ever come before. But of course, I do field research, so I got on the ground in Ukraine weeks after the Russians pulled out of Kyiv, because the Battle of Kyiv is probably the most decisive battle of the modern history, where the Russians attacked it with around 50,000 forces. There were only 3,000 military inside of the city, but the civilian population turned themselves into combatants, and they defended the city over a 3-month period. It was probably the most decisive urban battle that I've ever studied because it changed the strategic trajectory of the war. Had the Ukrainians lost Kyiv, it wouldn't be Kyiv today. It would probably be something else. And had the Russians not been defeated, again, the strategic goals would have changed either way. That's the decisive battle when it changes the course of the war. I got on the ground there. I started doing research on why they failed. I wrote that report. Because I have been doing Israel research for a long time, because I've been doing this for a decade, I also do underground warfare because it's another area where there's nobody doing it. So jump right in there. Been in tunnels all around the world, from North Korea to Azerbaijan to, of course, Gaza, Lebanon, all of that. When that war started, I had found out that we don't have war watchers anymore. If you understand the history of war, it was a common practice for other countries to go in and observe people's wars, just to have an understanding of the character of warfare, whether that's the creation of the mini ball and things like that. During our Civil War, the Germans were here, the British were here, the French were here, just observing. And across time, the United States did the same thing. We were observing the Japanese-China War. We had people on the ground getting an assessment of that. Over time, that became politically basically a practice we couldn't do anymore. If you're part of the State Department, you would understand that. Some people would point to Vietnam, where observers became advisors become boots on the ground. That was a lot of scar tissue there. But I found out two things. One is that nobody does this in the entire 2.8 million military members of the U.S. military. None are authorized to go inside of another combat zone to understand what's going on. Then I realized once I retired that although the State Department may put a combat zone as a level 4, do not travel, and if you have any association with the U.S. government, you can't go there, especially if you have a security clearance. But if you have a blue passport and you're crazy enough, then you can go anywhere you want at your own risk. So that's what I started doing in Ukraine, Azerbaijan, in order to do, which really academically really gets you to who wrote that history, what were their sources. Of course, we check people on what are your sources, right? And my mentor told me, "In God I trust, all others bring data." So where did those people get those data? For war, I also used to do staff rides before I retired, where you would go and walk the battlefield of Gettysburg and stand in a location where like Pickett's charge is running forward, but it actually dips down, so you could understand like why they would not be visible and just not mowed down. I find there's something very human and tactile to visiting a war zone and seeing the physical terrain as much as interview primary sources who actually fought there, not the filtered version of what they fought there. So that puts me in Gaza in December of 2023. So when October 7th happened, I'll probably spend the next little bit on Gaza if you guys don't mind, and we can do questions about any area of the world. But for me, it really became the case study for many reasons. But because I had been going to Israel, I wrote case studies about the 73 War of Suez City, 2002 Jenin. Israel has a long history of urban warfare and underground warfare, evolutions of it. I had already had connections, so I got on the ground. The U.S. Embassy said, "You can't be here." And I said, yes, I can. I've done this before. And I embedded, and now I'm the only person, I would say, outside of maybe an Israeli, who has embedded with the IDF in Gaza 6 times since October 7th. Every 3 or 4 months, I go there and I embed for my research, which also removes the filter for me of even if you knew the IDF and they were telling you what they were learning, it's still going through a filter, not through the lens of me, who I've walked a few urban battlefields. I teach urban warfare. I know what could happen, what should happen, what's the history of happening. And that's led me to being a voice about what's going on in Gaza. I've also been a voice against misinformation about laws of war or what's going on. Let's set the stage of Gaza in general, not knowing how much everybody knows, but it's just as a conversation piece and doing comparative analysis. So Gaza is a strip along Israel's border, 25 miles long, 5 to 7 miles wide, not that large area. The first misinformation I heard about Gaza was it was one of the densest places on earth. Look, I study cities for a living. Whoever said that's never been to India, which you have literally slums that are 1 million people in a square mile. Gaza is not even on the top 100 list. Yes, it has highly dense parts. It's also an area made up of 24 cities. 5 of those cities, 3 of them over 400,000, Gaza City itself over 1 million. It's a complete area of many cities. But when the war after October 7th, the invasion, I knew what was about to happen would be the biggest urban-centric war. Really important that people understand there's a difference between a war and a battle, right? A battle is a pitched fight in a certain location. A war may have many battles within it. And that's what we've seen in Gaza City, right? There's been the Battle of Gaza City, Khan Yunis, Rafah, you name it. But we'll talk about what happens when people view it as a singular and start aggregating data versus disaggregating data. And if you're an academic, that would be a bad thing to do that. But Gaza City, so Gaza, the physical terrain is this highly urbanized area with 2.2 million civilians within that area spread across mostly northern Gaza, but again, 1.1 in northern Gaza, Gaza City, and then spread across these different cities. But from a military history, right? These 4 areas that I told you about understanding urban warfare, you of course have to understand military history. Most urban battles that we talk about are meeting engagements, pretty much, where 2 militaries have met and decided that there would be an urban battle there. Like Stalingrad, one of the biggest urban battles of history. 1 million man versus 1 million man meeting in a city with really no tactical importance. It becomes a political battle, and they fight. More recently, of course, the U.S. military has a battle in Fallujah, Iraq in 2004. That's the largest battle of the entire Iraq war, larger than the Battle of Baghdad, which is a city of 6 million. But this small city in Fallujah of 400,000 becomes the biggest battle of the entire Iraq war. Fast forward to the 2016 Battle of Mosul. That's the largest battle since World War II, right? It's 5,000 maximum ISIS fighters in a city of 1 million, and it takes 100,000 security forces 9 months to liberate this city. But why was it the largest battle since World War II? Really gets you to the point to understanding urban warfare history is meeting engagements, is that if you give me enough time, I can hold a city for a very long time. Like in Stalingrad, there's one sergeant that holds an apartment building for 80 days against division level attacks, because there are some things you can do. I actually kind of burst onto a larger stage when the Russians invaded Ukraine. I wrote a tweet thread, and I do spend probably an unhealthy amount of time on X now. I wrote a tweet thread for the Ukrainians on, hey, this is what I would do with a little bit of urban warfare history, what I would do in my city if it was being attacked. That thread was seen by 20 million people, and that thread became a PDF, which became a manual that the Ukrainians translated in Ukrainian and published hundreds of thousands of copies seen all across Ukraine about how you defend a city as a civilian. Block the roads, stay covered, all these things you can do. For me, that's amazing. And now it's in 16 different languages, because despite how many people tell you that military's got this, there's not a lot of information about urban warfare, especially within civilians. So now it's in 16 different languages for anybody who wants to defend their urban terrain. There's some key things that have been learned across history that you can do, like slow the guys down. And that's one of the things with the Russians. They were just racing to all the cities. Like, go block the roads, go park a dump truck, which would cause a military, no matter a tank or what, a lot of trouble. Go park a dump truck and take the battery in the middle of the street. It'll cause you a problem. For Gaza, why is that important? Well, Mosul, that I just told you about, which is the biggest battle since World War II, the reason it's the biggest is because ISIS had 2 years. They were in the city for 2 years preparing it for battle. That's a long time. And it caused troubles that people didn't even imagine. They even took our concrete that the U.S. military, had left behind and stacked them in the roads. And there is nothing anybody could do about that. They even contacted me, which I thought was odd, but what do we do about this? They did a really good job. So but now you fast forward to Gaza, which has an urban warfare history from 2005. I just wrote the case study of the 2008 Battle of Gaza called Cast Sled, Operation Cast Sled. 20 years. No military since ancient warfare, which I have studied ancient warfare, no military has faced a defender who has prepared for 20 years for that battle. And that's the preparation of Gaza that the IDF was going to face. There are portions of Gaza that after 2005, when Israel disengaged and removed themselves, had never returned to, no matter how many battles there had been. And there have been frequent battles in Gaza based on the rocket supplies. As an urban warfare specialist, I knew that that meant a lot. What does that mean? Of course, just the preparation and the way that the city is built for defense and the way that the Hamas built their defenses, which gets you to the number, right? So let's say it's ahistorical to prepare urban terrain for 20 years for war. And that means something. Of course, we can point to the subterranean as the biggest indicator, like that's not normal. So I was just in Gaza City in October of last year, hours before the current 20-point peace plan, ceasefire, whatever you call it, was implemented. I was in Gaza City. Every 6 times that I've been in Gaza, it is more likely, factually, than not that there's a tunnel underneath me when I was walking. The new estimate is 600 miles of tunnels in this 25 miles long by 5 to 7 miles wide area. And it is just ahistorical that's ever been done. Now, there are a lot of tunnels in the world. Like, if you think about our Vietnam experiences, there's about 120 miles of tunnels, whether it's Cu Chi or the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In China, there's thousands of miles of tunnels. North Korea, they have underground airfields, underground naval bases, you name it. But I've never studied an area where that's the 600 miles of tunnels built underneath the civilians for the purpose of using the surface as a shield to the military underneath the civilians themselves. That's not my wording. That's what Hamas words it. And the one example that I give people, having been in Kyiv weeks after the Russians left, is when Russia attacked, not giving any notification because there's no requirement, and attacked all the cities, the civilians lived in the subway tunnels for months. They put hospitals down there, like 100 babies born in Kyiv underground, and they'll have an amazing story when they're liberated. All 2.2 million people in Gaza could fit in the tunnels of Gaza with ease, but Hamas, being who they are, say that they're not for civilians, and not a single civilian is ever allowed in them. But just from a strategy perspective, they could fit in this immense underground world that Hamas built that I've been into, and it's incredible, over billions of dollars invested in this subterranean network. From an urban warfare perspective, I can't find any like situation, but I'm going to give you one in a minute. The other aspect is the trapped civilians, right? Which gets you that civilian harm mitigation aspect. If you know what the history of civilian harm mitigation and the history of warfare are, you know what everybody else has ever done to protect civilians. Number one is the notification. So the dropping of flyers on civilians. Most people don't know, some people might, they're historians, know that we dropped flyers on Nagasaki and Hiroshima saying, look, this is a military city, a military objective, please leave. They called them LeMay flyers, basically, that were dropped. And that's a really big tactic. If the urban warfare is always a balance, no matter what the laws of war say, there's inherent built in the spirit of the laws that it's always a balance between military necessity and humanitarian imperative, which gets to Gaza as well. Like, even if it's okay to do, there's always this balance between the humanitarian imperative. So giving notification is not a requirement in the law of war. You don't tell the enemy you're coming. It actually could make it a lot harder on not only the attacking force, but the civilians. But there is the notification, and then there's all these processes of whether it's targeting or other aspects that you do to limit collateral damage. The presence of civilians in Gaza is very unique, though, because all this other history, to include, which everybody kept going back to, and luckily I had written the case study on the Battle of Mosul. Hey, remember what happened in Mosul? Like, yes, I remember what happened in Mosul. The government of Iraq told 1 million civilians, do not leave the city. I don't have a place for you to go. And there are a lot of human rights groups like Civic and others that come to this conference who said, that's bad. You can't do that, because civilians were dying rapidly. But the Iraqi government didn't have a place for them to go. And ISIS really didn't have the ability to keep them there. In mid-battle, the Iraqi government changed the guidance and told them to evacuate, told them where to go. And a lot of the civilians got out of this area. But in Gaza, unique to Gaza, is that Gaza is an enclosed area. It has a border with Egypt and has a border with Israel. There has been no other urban war in general, urban-centric or battle, in which a belligerent, not a part of the conflict, so not Israel, not Hamas, has stopped civilians from leaving the combat area. So if you haven't heard, Egypt, the border with Egypt, in my analysis, could have saved tens of thousands of lives. And in the beginning, in November of 2023, the Egyptian Foreign Ministry actually made a X post, again, my unhealthy amount of time on X, saying that they were building a humanitarian area in the Sinai Desert, which people that aren't that aware of the area, of course, you have Egypt, you have this vast Sinai Desert, and then you have Gaza, and there is a border between the two. And they initially said they were going to build one, which is the right thing to do. And what's happened in almost every other situation is you get the civilians out of harm's way and into international community-led, NGO-led humanitarian areas. And the right thing, I'm like, okay, this is great. And then a few weeks later, they decided that they wouldn't. And they launched an armor brigade towards the border with Israel, violating the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt to not only guard the border areas to make sure they built a new wall. So there's actually 3 layers of wall between Gaza and Egypt. And since October 7th, Egypt built a new wall to make sure that not a single civilian got out of Gaza, this very small area where there was about to be this giant war. Unless, and most people don't know this data point, this is more political than it is analysis, but 100,000 people have gotten out through the Egypt-Gaza border if they had anywhere from $2,000 to $10,000. You can buy your way out of Gaza, but as a general rule, you're not allowed out of Gaza. That in itself is a urban warfare ahistorical event, right? There's no parallel to that. Yes, there are places in Ukraine, 5 million people evacuated, and there were some countries that said, not us. But there was not one country with the ability to literally close the door and go, look, I don't care what goes on, you're not coming over here. And I believe that was a major mistake, because that changes, again, what the military can do for getting civilians out of harm's way. And of course, Egypt, by doing that, Israel had to build a humanitarian zone along the beach called the Al-Mawasi Humanitarian Zone. The reason it was selected because it's on the beach where they can't dig tunnels. So it's one of the few places in Gaza where Hamas didn't build extensive amounts of tunnels because of the water table. The closer you get to the sea, the higher the water table is, the less tunnels you have. All those variables meant on October 8th, what Israel was facing, there was no history to compare it to. Just not. A trapped civilian population that you can try to get out of harm's way, but they're ultimately the enemy, Hamas, would use that to their advantage, and they did so. So even within the safer area of the humanitarian zone, Mohammed Deft, who is the 30-year commander of Hamas forces, was killed on the edge of the humanitarian zone because Hamas, doing lawfare, used even the humanitarian zone as a shield, and that's whether it's hostages or commanders or whatever activity was happening in there. I only have 5 minutes left. So I wanted to cover something I hope comes out in the questions of the book that has guided my research more than I ever knew it would while I was at Georgetown in a master's program, was a book called Lies, Damn Lies, and Statistics. It's a great book. Talks about how you even structure a sentence with a statistic in it to make it not true, or the practice in social studies of just creating the biggest number you can, like 90% of smokers die of lung cancer. And whether it's true or not, making this statistic as big as you can so that you can make the problem as big as you can. That's what I started to see in Gaza from the very beginning. So I write case studies, right? I go looking, in my case studies at the end is always any number we can find on how many of the combatants died on both sides, how many civilians died, how many buildings were destroyed. I didn't realize, again, how much that would dictate. If you get nothing from my lecture, get this. The law of war is pre-ante, not post-facto. But for some reason, there's entire armies of human rights activists who I'm sure truly believe in their heart that this shouldn't be happening, war shouldn't happen. But they've tried to convince the world that the laws of war are post-facto. What does that mean? That means that I can take a number that I get from somebody, doesn't matter who, and use that as the sole determinant of whether somebody was being legal, ethical, moral, even good in their conduct. So that's like a casualty number, right? So taking a number, let's say 100,000 have died, and say, look, this proves that Israel was trying to kill civilians. That's not the way the law of war, let alone reality, works. The law of war is pre-ante. It is literally pages and pages of documents about what military should do with what information they have, right? That what does the commander know before he takes an action? What does the military know? And then you go through all this necessity, proportionality, and everything. But for some reason, the world's convinced that, but John, this many casualties, this many buildings destroyed, doesn't that prove intent? No, that's post facto. That's not the way the war, really what actions were taken and what did they do about it. I do urban warfare for a living. I'll give you two battles with some numbers, right? I talked to you about the 2016 to 17 battle of Mosul, biggest battle since World War II. We believe, we don't know, that there was a maximum number of ISIS fighters in that city of 5,000, right? We, the international world, mostly Iraqis, attacked with 100,000 forces and for 9 months fought to liberate that city. Now, John, what about the civilian casualties? A year later, the Iraqi government didn't know how many civilians had died. The mayor said it was 40,000. Eventually, the United Nations, doing some methodologies, got it between 9 to 11,000. And this is where, unfortunately, I birthed this saying of what is the civilian to combatant ratio, not knowing that it would backfire on me greatly, because now people think that's the determination of whether somebody is doing something good. What is this? What is their civilian to combatant ratio? And if you understand anything about the history, the laws of war, it has nothing to do with it. Let alone, as a researcher, the elements of where do you get the number and when do you get the number? There's never been an urban battle in history, never will be, when somebody can tell you in real time what is the death rate down to the single digit. But for some reason, because of Gaza, we believe that the Gaza Health Ministry can determine within minutes how many people died and whether they were civilians or combatants. Man, I wish I had more time. That's been the other thing in this determination. So statistically, be very careful about, one, post facto statistics in war in real time, and aggregating and disaggregating data, right? So if you ever hear a number about Gaza, and I know there are a lot of other urban battles happening right now, it's one big number, right? That's aggregated across now 2+ years of fighting. If we're being fair and then comparing it against some other urban battle, is that you would disaggregate that to battles, right? So like the Battle of Rafah, where there was probably one civilian killed to 100 combatants, because they got 90+% of the civilians out of harm's way in the Battle of Rafah. And if you went to the Battle of Gaza City 1 in November of 2024, you would have a much higher civilian death rate according to the Gaza Health Ministry. But if you went fast forwarded to October of 2025, you'd have a lot less. But the problem is that people aren't realizing that those are aggregated numbers, when if you really wanted to do an academic research, you would disaggregate the numbers to individual battles, because the context of the battles changed, how many combatants, how many missiles were being fired from enemy territory, all of that would change. But very specifically, I hope that we can talk about in the questions, is that it's that those numbers are stripped of all context of both sides. It's stripped of what did Israel do, and it's stripped of what did Hamas do. And I don't want to live in a world where that's possible, because that's a much more violent world. Because imagine, and I can show over across battles with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, you name it, from the Battle of Fallujah to the Battle of Gaza, that if that's a recipe for more urban warfare. And that's the paradox. If you show somebody that, if I want to win, because first Battle of Fallujah, the Al-Qaeda win, not on the field of battle, but in the media space. Same thing happened to the U.S. military in the first Battle of Fallujah. They killed Americans. We went in. Al Jazeera puts the number of civilian casualties growing every day. The American military must stop in 6 days. It gives a recipe for defeating people, to every person that wants civilians to die. And that's what I think Gaza is. Gaza is the worst case scenario of a recipe of using our values, Western militaries, the laws of war against you to achieve a political goal. And that's the paradox, is that if that is allowed to happen, if all this statistical warfare, of all this algorithm-driven TikTok thoughts about war, we'll live in a much more violent urban warfare world.
Okay. All right, thank you very much, John. That's a very rich discussion, and I think now we'll take we have about 40 minutes for Q&A. I guess I'll take the privilege to ask the first one, but you needn't wave your hand forever. I'll try to, if you get an acknowledgement from me, you're on the list. So I'll go to you, James, in a second. Yes, no, wave it till I see it. John, two questions. Similar in nature, but I'm a little surprised I didn't hear you mention the word we hear, it's ubiquitous, drones. So to what extent do drones change urban warfare even fundamentally? And another, I'm personally curious. I'm working on the China side a lot. By the way, there's a new museum in Shanghai you got to see, because it's about the Battle of Shanghai. This is.
I actually have a case study coming out on that.
There you go. Okay, he's ahead of me. But a lot of Chinese, of course, thinking a lot about the future of the tank. Are tanks relevant to urban warfare, or is the sort of common sense view that they have no major role in urban warfare, is that essentially true, and they're more or less obsolete, and especially in urban terrain?
Oh, those are great questions. So drones have an immense, of course, changing the character of warfare. As the professor in me, I can't help but explain that there's a difference between the nature of war that will never change. It's human, it's political, it's uncertain. Those are what we call the enduring nature of war. The character of warfare is always evolving. The technologies, the tactics, the strategies to achieve a victory. We could even talk about Iran, that there's been a change in the character of warfare, and we just saw that most people don't realize. But drones, having been in Ukraine, where they had already had drones before the war began, are whether you call them a cheap man's Air Force, they're an evolution of air power. Yes, absolutely, on the battlefield today, if you don't have drones and counter drone, you'll be found wanting. In the urban warfare specifically, actually the IDF faced us, where they had the world's best kamikaze drones, ISR drones, even variations of killer drones. They didn't have the drones they needed. Because again, the great equalizer of the urban terrain is that I pull you into that concrete jungle. I can negate all of your...
What about something like micro drones that are like these, almost like bugs going in?
Yeah. So I've done a lot in this space, to include the Chinese videos of like the robotic dogs and the micro drones is the biggest aspect, which we're actually applying to the tank, is that if I can pull you into the urban terrain, the defender has these 8 rules of it that I wrote. It's one of my articles, the 8 rules of urban warfare that we haven't been able to fix. Like the defender can choose just the time of the engagement because he gets to decide when to shoot. But the drones have changed in urban warfare is that the risk can be reduced to the attacker, right? So this is what the IDF found, like no matter how many drones they had above, they didn't have the drones they needed. They needed to have a drone that goes in front of the human and determines where the danger is. And if you understand how the commander of Hamas was killed, Yahya Sinwar, he was killed by a drone. Then you bring in the fire. So it isn't, for me, it's an evolution. In urban terrain, we've always talked about it, even protecting civilians. In the Battle of Morari, the Philippine military attacking were air delivering cell phones to trap civilians to be able to communicate better. So it actually, that paradox, drones give you the capability to improve every element of urban warfare for the military, whether you're defending. So the Ukrainians, most people don't know, one of the reasons that they succeeded in defending their terrain is they already had these very advanced drones and a software that integrated all of their drone feeds to a common operational picture. And then they started putting cameras on towers so they could actually see the Russians, even if it's 50,000 of them, every step of the way. And that information is different because it used to be exclusive to certain militaries. And ISIS showed us, going back to the Battle of Mosul, even before that you could start taking these civilian off-the-shelf drone capabilities and start having effects. But I'm not a drones and the changed everything about war. It's an evolution of things. And like the Shahed drones that are changing, if you don't have the defense for them, an integrated air defense, then you'll pay the price on the battlefield. Oh, tanks. I have a lot of podcasts about this. I was actually here one year and I said, look, if you want to reduce the level of civilian harm, tell militaries to buy more tanks. Because again, in order to liberate a city, defeat the enemy inside the city or whatever, you need mobile protected firepower. And that sounds like a paradox, an anomaly, because a tank's going to be vulnerable if it's by itself. And there are case studies where tanks were sent by themselves without the infantry they need to protect them from anti-tank munitions. But actually, when you get into it, you need to put a round of lethal effects onto a building very precisely. The tank comes with a 120 millimeter cannon that can punch through almost any concrete. It's a very precise weapon, despite what it looks like. The other aspect is the bulldozer. So the tank is absolutely needed, but where it became vulnerable, because entering all of these Middle Eastern and other places like the Caucasus, where there would be abundance of RPG, right? The AK-47 is the most distributed weapon in the world. The other one probably is the RPG. And an RPG, volley fire, can do even to the Abrams tank. We lost 6 Abrams tanks in the opening hours of the Second Battle of Fallujah because it volley fired and like cracks the sight blocks and things like that. So a tank now with an active protection system is a much more viable option. But if you're entering a defended urban terrain, the other aspect I would tell civilians, and just to make their eyes go big, is if you want to reduce civilian harm in urban areas, buy more bulldozers. Mm-hmm. Because all of these pitched battles where the enemy has had an amount of time to defend, Mawari, Mosul, and now Gaza, the bulldozer is what gives you the advantage to get into that terrain without going into what we call the wood chipper and losing all your soldiers.
Okay. James, and then.
So you described what sounds like a pretty daunting geostrategic problem, or in the paradox of urban warfare, in that you have a set of liberal democracies with increasingly low tolerance for collateral damage or civilian harm. You have a set of authoritarian or totalitarian entities that either are indifferent to civilian harm or, actively see it as part of their military strategy. Is there any way out of this paradox? What is the grand strategic set of options for liberal democracies and thinking about this or dealing with this?
Yeah, it's a great question. One is to recognize that it's not the future of warfare, it's the present. Almost every war zone I can talk to you about, the decisive moments are happening in the urban terrain. There is an element of the geopolitical aspect, especially for democracies or anybody who follows the law of war. Going back to my strongest recommendation is to, if you understand, which is again going to the military, is that militaries are designed for certain scenarios. And that was one of the discoveries we made in 2014. The U.S. military was designed for 7 defense planning scenarios, so like the worst case scenario, most likely, most dangerous. None of them involved anybody fighting on urban terrain. Because generals aren't, they say generals are comfortable fighting the last war. That's not true. They're comfortable fighting the war that they imagine. And that was, so these militaries, the biggest military in the world, and there are others that imagine some battle happening in the Volga Gap in the open plains. And now Ukraine's kind of giving them credence to it, even though the static nature of the Ukraine war is because of the urban battles and how they unfolded. And all roads lead to urban. They're still having urban battles. From a Western perspective, though, I can't break this, is that I still think it has both a positive and a net effect. Depending on what scenario you imagined, I was the sore, almost the voice that nobody wants to hear at NATO conferences, at United Nations conferences. One is that if you really look at it, like what we've seen in Iran, unfortunately, is that we're always attacking. Nobody's defending. And that's a real problem with Western militaries. What other people have thought through defending, area denial, and everything. I actually went to NATO. I told them all at a very big conference, like, this is a defensive alliance and everybody's attacking. Nobody's defending anything. If you're going to defend, enter the urban terrain. I'm also the person who stood at like the Explosive Weapons in Populated Areas Convention and said, this is a bad idea. If you restrict only those who follow the laws of war from certain tools, then you're driving warfare in the very place you're trying to keep it out of. Because, you can't use bombs if I go into the urban terrain? Well, guess where the battles will be? I don't have the geopolitical solution other than, and luckily I've watched China do their preparations for urban warfare. They're not prepared. And then you have kind of like the Taiwan and other scenarios. You have to be prepared to defend urban terrain across depth, to include having the ability for your civilians to stay protected. And unfortunately, like Israel, is like they have, everybody is required to have a bomb shelter that was specifically to bombs. But that level of preparation, I have a book coming out next year as well. And even if you were to build a new urban area, how would you build it to make it more defendable?
Let's go over here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
You mentioned near the end of your talk that we can't use what you described as post facto information, things like casualty numbers, to determine moral or legal culpability in warfare. So I'm curious how we, as citizens and media consumers, can make judgments on this sort of thing, since that more useful pre-ante information about what militaries know in a given situation can take a long time to come out, if it ever does.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is where I've had to insert myself in the genocide accusation towards Israel. And as non-military people, you just having informed criticism would be the most important thing. Like the post facto numbers, again, taking the number out of context, I can do whataboutisms where I can show like the outrage wasn't there for these other cases of hundreds of thousands and all these different environments, just as let's inform the debate. But if we were having a debate, words have to have definitions. So even in the post facto world, one is you have to understand, what does the law actually say, the law of armed conflict, and how is it assessed, right? Who's responsible for assessing the law of armed conflict? Both within willingness of information environment and those bodies like within the United Nations and their history. For me, it starts with words having definitions. So like genocide definition, war crime, crimes against humanity, all those have very specific definitions. So when you hear an argument of a post facto analysis, who's giving information, where they get it? What does the context of the accusation, what are the definitions that we all have to agree upon? Like genocide, we'd have to agree upon, what does the Genocide Convention say? It's only 2 pages long. It doesn't take that long to read. And then how are we doing critical thinking, which is really what's come from me. One is hopefully people learn that post facto is not the way it works. It can, if it's an actual investigation, like a single event, like we know this many people died in this event, like we're currently dealing with the unfortunate attack or that happened on the school in Iran. We can start post facto going, that's bad. Okay, we demand our information on that strike being investigated in timely amount of analysis. That's about where it is, but just a general better understanding of also this intermixing of, so if you were doing a post facto analysis of too many civilians have died, I would want that person I was debating to be able to understand what classifies somebody in the law of armed conflict as a combatant or non-combatant. In my world, there are no civilians. You're either combatant or non-combatant. Most people, to include Joe Rogan, believes in order to be a combatant, you have to have carrying a weapon in your hand and being a part of the other military. That's unfortunate because that's not what the law of armed conflict, which all nations of the world have agreed to on what makes somebody a combatant, meaning they're participating in the hostilities. They're not just a named member of the opposing force, but they're participating in hostilities, such as reporting intelligence. And there's a story of I give a grandma calling in a Russian convoy in front of her house in Ukraine. If you understand the law of armed conflict, you understand that while she had that phone to her ear reporting the information, she could be killed. Once she put it down, she no longer could be. Those are some of the nuances. You can carry ammo. You can hold a hostage in your house. You're no longer a civilian, you're a combatant. And you can do a bunch of things to make yourself a combatant. So in order to do any type of analysis, you have to have shared definitions. You have to have an understanding of the topic and then how it's supposed to work.
Yes, sir. Yes, you.
Hi. Sorry, I was recently listening to the 2025 Christmas wish list episode of your podcast. Thoroughly enjoyed it. One thing that really stuck out to me was this idea how military shouldn't be leading with their faces anymore. And I was hoping you could kind of talk more about that and the idea of using low-cost drones and things like that, and just what does that look like of actual training and new laws to implement this idea of not leading with your face?
Sure. Thank you so much. And every year at the end of the year, I meet up with the other two urban warfare experts of the world. One's a Brit, and one's a Canadian. We're all very close friends, and we, despite doing it for the 5 years, we could just keep saying the same Christmas list. So not leading with your face as an attacker, right? So defender, attacker, and I could make we do make Christmas lists basically for both. Based on the realm of technology today, what I say is that, and I actually just wrote an article, Training Like 1993, where I went and observed a U.S. military force that's not doing this, and they're training like it's 1993. The urban battles that I go around to, from Ukraine to Azerbaijan to Gaza, is that there's no reason a soldier should walk down the street, walk into a room, turn a corner without some expendable drone in front of it. That's not leading with your face. There's this, there's SWAT movie tactics. It's called enter and clear a building that most people have seen in movies. And I actually did a How Real Is It episode for TV, where everybody's on the outside of a door and then they all rush into the door. That's leading with your face. Today, there's no reason to do that. The cost of drones, where they used to be millions and thousands of dollars, they're not. You should not be leading with your face ever in urban warfare. And that's what you saw the IDF evolve to, although they went into it prepared for it and not having that. And they were ordering off Amazon like everybody else. There's a unit, the 55th Brigade, that starts in Gaza on October, November, whatever, 6th, with 0 tactical drones. And before they leave 55 days later, they have 250. And they're not, because the first casualty, you'll realize it's a bad idea. And Israel kind of cornered the tactic of not going through windows and doors in the early 2000s. They put holes in walls and walk through the walls so they're not vulnerable, right? Because where are the casualties? But that's the point of that. Stop leading with your face. They even have remote control bulldozers now. The 72-ton bulldozer, they can remote control it where there's no human in it. I don't believe we'll ever get to the point where you have Iron Man suits because of the human nature, but there's no reason that there can't be something ubiquitous in front of me so I don't get surprised. The first Medal of Honor of the American military in Afghanistan, Sal Junta, walked into an ambush, a Taliban ambush, and that's a severe mistake by the U.S. military to ever put somebody in an open field and not know what's in front of them 100 meters, let alone urban terrain.
Over here in the corner, yeah.
Thank you. I know it's big, but maybe spend a few minutes talking about your expertise and your research about what insights you might have in like a couple of minutes about a U.S.-China conflict over Taiwan and how that intersects with urban warfare.
Sure. Yeah, I know. Do you want to take it? From a tactical perspective and from a more strategic perspective, of course, I'm sure he could cover the one China policy and all of that, the political aspect. War is the pursuit of political objectives. From a operational, so we have these levels in the military that people confuse all the time. the tactical, where the fighting's happening, the operational, which is more of a theater level, and then the strategic, the entire war. If China wanted to take Taiwan and did it rapidly, there's nothing anybody could do about it, because speed still matters in warfare. And so this is where I've sometimes been asked to compare Ukraine, what Ukraine did to what Taiwan might do. And this is where the apples to oranges doesn't apply, where in Taiwan, there is no gun culture. In Ukraine, not only were they handing out 30,000 AK-47s and 2 magazines to any civilian that would walk up to a truck all across the city, did you have hundreds of thousands of conscript, former Soviet militaries. And that's why really you could call it the grandpa battle, because there were a lot of grandpas that were former soldiers now with weapons that Russia introduced into the environment. None of that would be present in Taiwan. They don't have a gun culture. They have a paintball club that they want to turn into a gun culture. They don't have the arms, and let alone just the cultural aspect. I mean, how many people in the history of war have been conquered psychologically, right? When we drove a tank in the middle of Baghdad and did circles, we ended a war because of the psychological impact that did. And had the people rose up against us, it would have went awful. But there is a psychological element for Taiwan. If the Chinese were able to, although they haven't been tested in over 70 years in war, let alone urban warfare, if they could get into that and rapidly take that cognitive center of gravity, there would be nothing the United States could do about it.
I concur. That's a good. Yes, sir, in the back. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering if you could speak to the humanitarian aspect of this topic. I'm specifically interested. You mentioned Mosul, and that's like a big case study on trauma response and how humanitarian responses, adapted to urban armed conflict. And I was wondering, what are the key takeaways in your perspective of how humanitarian response can adapt in these settings?
Yeah. One is prepare, right? So the amount of preparation that could be done, which is a big part of what we would talk about in the conference here, is that it's the commander's responsibility to think through the humanitarian needs of the population. It's just a factor of, especially a Western military. Again, Gaza becomes a very unique situation. And I wrote this article not to be macabre or critical. I try to be fact-based. Is that in the history of modern warfare, going back to World War I, there's never been a military who has provided aid to the enemy's population inside of enemy terrain while they're still holding ground and hostages. Not World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, none of them. What is, though, that doesn't negate the responsibility, just fact. Never happened because, again, I'm trying to point to the unique context in which the world has allowed, especially Egypt, which I think could have been forced. That would have been very like Mosul, is this create a humanitarian zone where all essential medical, any potable water, everything could have been completely out of harm's way, just 5 kilometers into the desert. There is the other aspect of not only preparing and getting food to this population, but who tracks it, who's reporting it, who's spreading misinformation and aspects of that. I went there. Most of the times when I go there, I'm not on a tour. A lot of people criticize me just seeing what the IDF wants me to see. I literally in bed, I tell them what I want to see, whether that's the American pier. I went to that location and when it floated away, horrible idea. I went to all the locations. You see these fields of aid. I analyzed who's counting trucks, how trucks counted, to include Israel mistakes, to be clear. And one of the mistakes, I actually had a very smart expert on my podcast, Lori, a professor at Emory, about what are the requirements in siege warfare to send food in. The law says you do not have to send food in if the enemy diverts it, but that doesn't negate your responsibility of balancing humanitarian imperative enemy. But it was also about what the Israelis were starting to talk about, moving the aid distribution to the south to try to go into areas they hadn't ever cleared. That was a horrible mistake because it gave the view that Israel was purposely not sending food in, even though there was ample amounts of food. It was just they were moving it to different areas. So then there could be this soundbite that Israel didn't send food in for 11 weeks. And that nobody cares about the 40,000 trucks that had gone in right before that, and that they had moved this food into the south. So it's a much longer, but from a future of war is that understanding the necessity of providing that aid outside of combat areas. And I really want the message to be to the world to never let a Gaza situation happen again. And that's not to be who's doing the right thing, who's doing the wrong thing. I just want the history to record what happened and what can we do to make sure it never happens again. We could have put a lot of pressure that the right thing to do was to create a humanitarian zone in the Sinai Desert.
Yes, sir.
So this is sort of a direct follow-up to what you just partially addressed.
Yeah.
But I'm curious how you'd evaluate IDF harm mitigation as compared to recent military histories, best practices, and the laws of war.
Sure. I've written that in a few different variations, and I get quoted. The words have meanings. So I'll make this statement and then back it up. Israel has implemented more civilian harm mitigation measures than any military in history. The only person who's ever tried to challenge me that, there was a guy who is a civilian harm mitigation expert who said, John Spitzer may be correct, but he's wrong. Because he said, doesn't matter that they implemented more measures, they weren't effective. Like, oh, we're playing the post facto game of how are you saying they're not been effective? Because this number of civilian casualties, this number of buildings destroyed, all this. When again, that's not the way the law works. So the civilian harm mitigation measures, I've written this in a couple of variations. Again, I take what any military, to include the US military, in even in Mosul and other places have ever done. Number one step, evacuate the civilians, even though you lose the element of surprise. How you notify civilians, right? All of the things that Israel does with the phone calls, the voice messages, the loudspeakers on drones, all this stuff nobody's ever done before. Just the ability to notify. And then creating corridors, which is not new, like the green corridors, safe corridors for them to evacuate. On top of that, Israel created a civilian harm mitigation cell with a one-star general in charge of it that isn't normal in large wars as well, who developed a unique technology to track civilians by their cell phones, by satellite imagery, drone footage, all of this, and to color code their maps in real time by presence of civilians. And then put restrictions on the IDF that they couldn't even return fire from those zones if they took fire. That's never happened in modern history. Soldiers always had the right of self-defense, but out of the concern for the civilian harm mitigation, if it was a red zone with a lot of civilians, it didn't matter if they were taking fire from there, they didn't have the permission to return fire. Then you can go through what they actually do in targeting to prevent civilian harm, which is what everybody else does, the choice of munition, the timing of the attack, watching the target. You can go to them handing out their own maps that never happened in history as well. So the IDF, we had this way to cut up a city into different zones and the number of those zones. And I teach that. The IDF, of course, know that. And then they handed those maps to civilians to better communicate with civilians left in the environment. And every day they would say, look, Khan Yunis, we'll be in area 241. If you're a civilian in this area, please continue to leave. If you're not in that area, don't come to this area. That's where combat's going to happen. That level of communication and giving up the element of surprise, the tactical pauses. So if you look at the number of times the COGAT used to list these across for the intensity of the battle, hundreds of days, every day, Israel was stopping the battle for a certain number of hours, for like 8 hours, to allow for civilian evacuation, allow for humanitarian aid. Never happened in any other battle I've ever studied. In Mosul, they stopped because they were losing so many soldiers, and they stopped for like 2 weeks to reorganize. But to stop the battle every day, this is the paradox, right? Because clearly this stuff is protracting the battles. All of these steps that Israel is doing, clearly you're protracting. And also giving the enemy a sanctuary where you're never going to go because of hostages, gave the enemy a sanctuary to where they protracted this battle. By keeping that gate closed to Egypt, you protracted this battle. and created this paradoxical problem that nobody else had. I wanted to tell you about one battle that I didn't mention, but you make me think of it in the humanitarian question. The only U.S. military experience that relates to Gaza is the 1945 Battle of Manila. If you don't remember this battle, and some people laugh that I go back to World War II, and it's really important, is that when the U.S. military gets kicked out of the Philippines in World War II, we return and MacArthur hits the beaches of the Philippines and says, go to Manila and get our people. Because in the city of Manila, there were 3,000 to 4,000 internees. So both prisoners of war, but also civilian men, women, and children, basically hostages in that vernacular back then, internees being held in the city of Manila, which is a city of 1 million, that the Japanese decided at the last minute, so didn't really prepare for very long, to defend. So it's actually a Japanese Navy of 17,000 defenders. That's a lot. McCarthy, a Navy, but they did a great job. They actually sunk some of the ships. They pulled the guns off the ships. They used the tunnels. So there's a sewers in Manila. They had a subterranean element that they did really good on popping in and out of. They had really strong buildings that we built. But out of the concern for the civilians and the civilian infrastructure, MacArthur gives an order that there is no air power to be used in the attack of Manila. So that actually discounts, which is a paradoxical myth, that the more bombing leads to more civilian harm. Going back to, if you take away the ability, then that gives the enemy more ability to protract and defend. And it's about, of course, precision, but also lethality. So MacArthur says, go liberate our people in the city. Don't use any air power. MacArthur loved Manila. He served there. His dad served there. So we attack with about 35,000 American and Philippines military. We have a very protracted block by block battle, and 100,000 civilians died in this battle. So 17,000 defenders. And we actually know they all died because most of them committed hara-kiri rather than surrender. Very few surrendered to the 100,000 civilians. And that number seems that's 1 to 6, whatever it is. But it is more lies, damn lies, and statistics, because the 100,000 civilian deaths, who killed the 100,000 civilians? Mostly the Japanese, who were slaughtering civilians as this battle was approaching and just stacking civilians up in the bottom of basements, massacring them. And they actually created a humanitarian crisis as well. They started starving them weeks in advance, so they knew when the Americans showed up, they'd face a humanitarian crisis in order to feed the population. But that battle alone is one of the last few analogies that somebody might make to a battle in Gaza, but not a war.
Okay, that's great, John. Let's we have just about 5 or 6 minutes left, so maybe I'll just stack up a few questions here, and then
Okay.
you can pick and choose.
Let's do it.
I do feel like we have to talk about Iran for 1 minute, so please. Well, we're not laughing. I mean, with all your professional expertise, your experience in the Middle East, et cetera, do you think that U.S. ground forces will eventually be used, whether urban or not? And then let's get some, yes, ma'am, and then you, sir, have been patient. Yeah.
I guess my question is, why do you think, if you could shed any light on if Israel has gone to a great extent to mitigate casualties, why it is like one of the most criticized armies in the world, the IDF, compared to lots of other conflicts that are happening right now, like the genocide in Sudan, issues in Congo, Iran even. I've noticed that even when this whole conflict just sprung up, our campus, for example, was silent.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Hold on.
Oh, I forgot.
Get one more.
That's right. Sorry. That's a good one.
It's a similar question, actually. So the picture that you painted, I think we would all probably agree that it stands in stark contrast to the representation of that conflict, specifically Gaza, by, some of the world's leading media organizations, human rights organizations, including hundreds of former military personnel in Israel. And so why are they wrong and why are you right?
Sure. And then let's see. This fellow had one last hand here. Third, do you want to weigh in?
Sure, it would be wrong. On X, I've noted that you have observed that the American and Israeli Air Force have successfully targeted the infrastructure of the siege and the IRGC that are used to control population and put down popular uprisings for freedom. I was interested in your view on the success. How would you evaluate those strikes? Will they lead to the conditions on the ground for the Iranian people to rise up and success?
Okay, 5 minutes. That's a lot to handle.
That's a lot to handle.
Yeah.
I'll try to address this one because I have faced this a lot. Everything from going against people that are considered genocide scholars, people that are considered war experts, even. So going back to, I've had to debate a lot of people where they can have their own opinions of what's going on, but not their own facts. So how do you obtain facts? There is an element of, I based my assessments based on what I've seen on the ground. So 90% of the people that would oppose that, or the research that I've done, right? So if I tell you that I strongly believe John Spencer's opinion that the Israel government, the political government's intention wasn't to destroy the people in Gaza, I'm making that assessment not just on what I've observed the IDF doing, which are following orders, but my 3 interviews, the prime minister, the interview with the minister of defense, both chiefs of staffs, to include the actual orders given, and analyzing the same statements that are made by that political leadership, because really that's been a big field of my debates with people, is their interpretation of somebody's statement, usually taken out of context, whether that's the prime minister, the president, or the minister of defense. And that's one example. For the other, that they take, like, remember Amalek, which is actually posted in Geneva as what it means, not what somebody interprets that it meant in that statement, but also asking the individual, like, what is your intention? Or gathering this, how can we all look at the same pot of information that we have access to? And yes, I have access to information that nobody has. I'll tell you one secret, because I've actually had to question myself, is the Prime Minister of Israel mentioned my name in his address to Congress, that I said the statement that I gave here, that Israel's done more, implemented more civilian harm mitigation measures than any military in history. That's a fact that can be debated with data. What has anybody else ever done? What is Israel doing? Now, you could debate whether they're effective. That's a different data point. But that fact, well, that got me a New York Times team investigating me for a year. Recalling my contract from West Point. But no, and it was a great, awful process to determine if I'm an expert, because that's where they'll usually, in debate, you can challenge the appeal to authority, the expertise, like, why you, John Spencer? So New York Times dug into whether I'm an expert, what is my scholarship, what are my visits, and then whether I have a bias based on my representation. This is the whole idea that I'm pro-Israel, so my voice should be discounted, when this is the critical thinking. Like, no, facts and who has information and what was collected. Most organizations who are making assessments of Israel's conduct have a gap in what they know. Where did they get information? Yes, there are IDF soldiers that will say something different in their units, and I never will say that soldiers don't do the wrong thing on the battlefield. And there's been plenty of soldiers in almost every war who have done the wrong thing. But as a general, what is the intent? What are the actions of units? I'm basing those based on my own information. And I've had to, what is it that somebody is saying, and attack. I never attack the organization or the person. I attack the veracity of the claim and what is the evidence in which they're using, like I did when the genocide scholar Omar Bartab wrote a 6,000-word document in New York Times that said, I'm a genocide scholar, Israel is committing genocide. I wrote, I'm a war scholar, Israel is not committing genocide, and simply by deconstructing his evidence that he was saying, the statements, and then he used all the numbers. Statements will give you intent. All the numbers, he and everybody else, really where most people go wrong, is the number. But they don't have enough information. It's almost like Dunning-Kruger effect. Like, they don't know that they don't know. Like, that's not how it works. And I can give you all kinds of comparisons on numbers, but if we're going to, it's not that John Spencer's right and they're wrong. It's like, we're not even talking about the same thing, because you think the number proves the statement you made, and it does.
Thank you very much, John Spencer, for sharing your deep expertise. And I would just say one thing that I admire most about John's work is he's committed to going to these places and seeing them with his own eyes. And that's really just a stunning level of bravery. And we're thankful for your insight. And I hope that you'll be back frequently, as I know you do come to Brown a lot, and that's great. And Omar Bartov's name came up. He is a very famous scholar here at Brown. He served in the IDF and knows a lot about this situation too. And of course, he's been in front of in this forum many times, and we'll welcome all views here at Brown at Watson to investigate these very difficult questions from all angles. But I want to thank the audience too for a really great civilized debate on such a hard and emotive issue. So thanks for all for coming. And John, once again, please come frequently.
Thank you.
Thanks.